Western cultural and spiritual narratives are the foundation of the prevailing global order. But as the balance of power tilts from west to east, that may change. What if, instead, we lived in a world governed by the ethics of the East? Can we imagine a city, a country, or even a planet built on the precepts of Buddhism? I'm Dawn Nakagawa, president of the Berggruen Institute in Los Angeles, and this is Futurology. In this episode, our guest is Stephen Batchelor. Batchelor has written extensively about a secular brand of Buddhism that could extend beyond the temple and use the dharma, or teachings, to reorient society's moral compass. At the height of the 60s counterculture, a wave of spiritual seekers descended on the Indian subcontinent, seeking enlightenment and an escape from Western religious dictums. Batchelor was one of those pilgrims. As the decades passed, self-made gurus like Ram Dass and true believers like George Harrison of the Beatles brought the Dharma back to the West. This ancient Eastern cosmology seeped deeply into the mainstream. What Batchelor calls secular Buddhism has taken root in unexpectedly large swaths of Western consciousness in the form of mindfulness culture. But Batchelor envisions an awakened society of a different kind. In his book, After Buddhism, he writes that awakening to this reality informs us that all living beings are intimately connected to a complex series of causal conditions that came before them, and to a seemingly infinite unfolding of future consequences that depend on their actions. In short, karma for materialists. In this episode, Batchelor speaks to Bing Song, the head of Berggruen Institute's China Center, about Buddhist metaphysics. What's to come is a robust back and forth about whether the idea of infinite causation opens up the possibility of a new planetary order at the individual, local, and global levels. And now, Bing Song and Stephen Batchelor on Futurology.
Stephen, it's so nice to have you here, and it's a great honor to have this opportunity to interview you. I want to start with the first question I want to start with is more personal in a way. I mean, I'm sure you get asked a lot this kind of questions. You've had an amazing life journey, first as an ordained monk in Tibetan tradition, and subsequently is in Zen tradition in South Korea. And then, of course, afterwards, you are the Buddhism researcher, writer, speaker, and then you're the major shaper of secular Buddhism. So, but first thing first, I really wanted to know why at a young age you decided to become a monk, in India. And then what was the, so to speak, what was the karma that led you to that kind of decision? That decision was very unusual at the time and even now, right? It's a very unusual decision. So can you share us your personal stories?
I'll try to be as brief as possible. I grew up really in the 1960s, just outside London. It was the counterculture that really gave me most of my interesting ideas. I was rebellious, as many people were at that time. And I blamed a lot of my discontent on the society in which I lived in England. And the goal of many subcultural fantasies at that point was to go east. India, China, Japan, anywhere but Europe or America. And I followed what was then called the hippie trail out to India. I traveled overland. I was 18 years old. I'd just left high school. And I ended up, when I crossed the Indian border, a couple of days later, in the Dalai Lama's community in Dharamsala. And just at that time, an institute had been established there by His Holiness for teaching Buddhism to the Westerners who were showing up at that period. And I immediately started doing that. I had no great prior interest in Buddhism or Eastern philosophy before then, but once I was exposed to these ideas, but more particularly when I was exposed to the people who embodied these ideas, in other words, the Tibetan people, not just the lamas and so on, but the ordinary Tibetan people who were living in exile. They had nothing. They'd been kicked out of their country. And I was enormously impressed by their quality of being. And once I began exploring the philosophy, the religion, the language of Tibet, I very quickly realized that this is really what I wanted to do. I think in some ways it was probably like realizing here is an unknown frontier. Here is something that we know nothing about in the West. And here are these people who embody this incredible humanity. And that's what led me into a deeper study of Buddhism. And once I got very much involved in the theory and the practice and meditation and so on, I recognized that if I'm going to take this seriously, then I need to have, a traditional Buddhist framework within which to pursue these trainings. And that, of course, was becoming a monk. That was the principle behind it all, really, which goes back, of course, to the Buddha. Taking ordination as a young person in a Buddhist tradition is really a sign of your willingness to commit yourself wholeheartedly. No marriage, no kids, no job, just focus on the Dharma. And so I jumped in. And I've been jumped in for the last 50 years now.
That's amazing. So if you were to estimate like 1, 2 out of 10 people who actually went to India with you and then stayed on, end up being loyal, I mean, what's your guess?
The number?
Yeah.
Gosh, it's very hard to say. But what I can say is that most of my colleagues, not people I necessarily know well, who've been instrumental in establishing Buddhist ideas, writing books, opening meditation centers, nearly all of them started with this same journey. Mm-hmm. There's not many of us, probably 100, 200 or so. And it was a very small community in Dharamsala at the time, maybe 20, 23, 20, 30 people max who were actually there in a committed way. Mm-hmm. A lot of people came, did a couple of courses, left. Difficult to say, but really just a handful, if I'm honest.
Right. How was your family reacting to your decision becoming a monk there?
Well, when I wrote home to my mother and told her I was going to become a monk, she said, my heart fell into my feet. It simply didn't fit with anything in her experience that she could explain at all. It was completely weird. And here I was on the other side of the world almost. We had no, Zoom or Wi-Fi or anything then, just airgrams. There's no way to really communicate, even speak. So no, she was fairly horrified, actually. I had another side of my family, my mother's sister, actually, who was interested in Hinduism and belonged to a Hindu-based group in London. So there was some sympathy from that side of the family. But broadly speaking, becoming a Tibetan Buddhist monk at that age, forsaking a career, marriage, family, and so on, was seen as a complete break with everything that they knew and they valued.
Right.
For sure. Yeah. And that was difficult.
Yeah. I can imagine. Yeah. So I think, you speak, or at least you read multiple languages, right? Tibetan, I imagine, right? Or Sanskrit, Pali?
I used to speak Tibetan quite well.
Right.
I can read Tibetan. I read Pali, not so well, but adequately. And I live in France, so I speak French.
Right.
I've also spoken German in the past. But yes, I do have some gift for languages,
I think
which is helpful.
Your experience and backgrounds, I think it's the sort of, the most privileged kind of a backgrounds for Dharma teaching and then Buddhism research, because you speak all the languages and then you actually read the classics in those languages and you've done the translation, right? So that's absolutely amazing. So, and I can see, looking at your experience, you are, we can say you're really exposed to 3 major traditions of Buddhism, right? Theravada, Tantric, and Mahayana Buddhism. So you really have experience, to experience these 3 major traditions and stuff. So just want to hear your points of views about what are the major differences between these 3 traditions, in terms of their core teachings from your personal experiences point of view.
Well, my Tibetan Buddhist training was with a school called the Gelugpa, and they're the more scholarly of the Tibetan Buddhist schools. They're the ones to which the Dalai Lama belongs. And so my main interest in Tibetan Buddhism was not Tantric Buddhism as such. I did a number of basic Tantric sort of exercises and practices, but my main interest and what my teachers wanted really to drill into me was not mandalas and mantras and stuff. It was, believe it or not, logic, epistemology, philosophy, doctrine, psychology. In other words, getting a grasp of the fundamental conceptual framework within which Buddhism had been perpetuated, particularly in North India, until the Muslim invasions and the exile of the Indian monks to Tibet that then established the foundations of Tibetan Buddhism. So my Tibetan Buddhist practice was really a training in critical thinking. It was a training in what, if Tibetan Buddhism had a god, it would be theology. I think of myself as a theologian, someone who thinks about spiritual, existential questions within the framework of what is recognized as a world religion, Buddhism. I got involved in Theravada Buddhism while I was a Tibetan Buddhist monk. I sat a 10-day Vipassana meditation retreat with a teacher called Goenka. And that introduced me to the practice of mindfulness. This was back in 1974. And that was a transformative experience. And I think what Theravada Buddhism, early Buddhism gave me was a much more embodied and immediate sense of what these principal teachings were about. So I'd heard endless teachings on impermanence and suffering and emptiness and all these things from my Tibetan teachers. But it was only when I started to practice Vipassana, paying much, much closer attention to the immediate lived experience of the here and now, that I began to really understand what these terms meant. So early Buddhism, or Theravada Buddhism, really gave me an insight into the fundamental sort of embodied perspective on life that goes back very much to the historical Buddha. I then went and trained in Zen in Korea. And what that really provided me with was not only a very rigorous training in contemplative practice. We would sit for 3 months in the summer, 3 months in the winter, just facing a wall, asking the question, what is this? And that served very much to give me a discipline in basic contemplative practice without any of the razzmatazz of complicated visualizations or mantras or anything like that, but rather just to come to terms with the question of being human, or the question of being sentient, really, the question of being a living creature on this earth, and not to immediately say, well, it's like this or it's like that, but to hold that experience in a deep questioning, not in any form of words. Even what is this falls away, but it brings you into a very lived sense of wonder, of sheer astonishment and amazement that we are here at all, and to just rest in that, to honor questions rather than constantly be looking for answers. And that's a habit of mind I think humans all have, to want to know the truth, to want to know what's right, what's the good, the correct view, the wrong view, heresy, But in Zen, you just return to the question for which all religions and philosophies pretend to give us the answer. We honor the questioning. And those, I think, would be the three major takeaways. Critical thinking, mindfulness, and wonder.
Okay. But all three traditions, do they, I assume they make a distinction between the sort of ultimate truth, the teaching of ultimate truth, and it's called the expedient and skillful means, truth, right? Yeah. So in a way, you have two graded or levels of teaching. Is that true with all the three traditions? From what I'm hearing, it seems to be Zen Buddhism is really trying to reach the so-called the ultimate truth in a way. In a way, it's not as, the training that you had is not as much about the expedient means or partial revelation, or however you call it. So, all three traditions try to distinguish the two kinds of teaching?
all of these three major traditions are founded upon this distinction between ultimate and relative truth.
Right.
And all of them seek to find skillful means whereby you can arrive at insight into ultimate truth. But what I've come to learn since I ceased to be a monk, really, is that we don't find this distinction made by the Buddha himself. The Buddha never once uses the distinction between ultimate truth and relative truth at all. And this, when I discovered that, was a shock, because I'd been told by people like the Dalai Lama that this is the foundational conceptual frame within which Buddhist practice operates, and yet nowhere in the Pali Canon, in the suttas, the discourses, does the Buddha use those terms or anything comparable to them. So I'm actually suspicious of this primary distinction. I think of it as a binary split that does have some, it has some purpose. I recognize it does have a value, but it's basically dualistic. It's basically suggesting that there's two kinds of truth. And when I was a Tibetan Buddhist monk, they went to great lengths to try to show how the two truths are not contradictory. In other words, and becomes extremely complex, theorizing, essentially. And I think they realized that this is not sitting very happily one with the other. So I've given up that distinction altogether. I think if the Buddha could do without it quite adequately, I don't see why we need to perpetuate it. And I think in doing so, to give primacy to some ultimate truth is arguably not in the spirit of how the Buddha originally presented the Dharma.
So my understanding of this, if I may share, is the when at the level of forms, let's say, and then you are able to find some rules of the game, and then this is sort of it could be sort of relative truth at that level. But then I think the Buddha's teaching, especially let's say in Diamond Sutra or even in the Heart Sutra, they were talking about essentially the ultimate or nirvana is really not about forms, right? So you need to go beyond that. So that's why, in a way, my understanding of the convenient and expedient means is really to attract people into this path. Once you are on this path, you really have to, at a certain point, you need to kind of get rid of the forms. Let's put it that way, And then, but what that final truth is actually beyond the words, right? Beyond, you can't describe it as ineffable. So that's what, in a way, but people tend to think in terms of forms. So that's why it's so hard to comprehend that ultimate truth. So it's not convenient to comprehend that, but doesn't mean that that's not there. So that's my kind of a read of it. I mean,
no, that's a perfectly reasonable way to go about it. And that's, I think, probably what many Buddhists would likewise agree to. Personally, though, I don't find that languaging helpful anymore. And I'm also not persuaded, actually, that the finding of the ultimate truth or simply truth of the big T is really what this practice is about. My sense is that when the Buddha uses the word satcha, or truth, he actually uses it not so much to designate the truth, but he uses it as a virtue, as a term for a virtue. Satcha, which we translate as truth, is probably better translated as truthfulness. Truth is a virtue. To live a life truthfully, and that to a large extent has to do with an honesty with oneself, an honesty and a directness in one's discourse with others, a seeking of a kind of authenticity of one's life, to not live in contradiction with one's own thinking, to harbor contradictory ideas, and at the same time to learn to articulate and express oneself in a language that is to the point, that honors the experience of the other, and is a vehicle whereby we can learn to live together better, both with our own experience and also in community and so forth. This quest for truth is something that I've long given up with, to be quite honest. Of course, just because I say that doesn't mean that Buddhism is going to drop the idea. Certainly not. But I do think we're at a time where Buddhism perhaps is looking, or I would argue, that Buddhism is at a point where it needs a real paradigm shift. In other words, to move away from a truth-based way of thinking, a truth-based metaphysics, to a task-based ethic. In other words, the point is not to understand that suffering is a characteristic of existence, which is the traditional Buddhist view. Everything is suffering. And to learn that that is the case, and to see how, that is the truth. The truth of suffering is the first of the Four Noble Truths, after all. If you look closely at the Buddha's first discourse, he doesn't speak that way at all. The point of suffering, of noticing and attending to, as one does with mindfulness and basically life itself, is to learn how to enter into a different relationship with something. The point of the whole exercise, and if you go back to the Buddha's first discourse, he's not trying to project or teach or distill in people what the truth is. He's asking us to enter into a new relationship with our experience now. So rather than making suffering the truth of suffering, he's asking you to embrace suffering, to comprehend suffering, to say yes to suffering. It's about relationship with one's own inner suffering, with the suffering of others, both those close to you and to the enormous suffering we see in the world globally. It's to really ask, how can I be with that? How can I embrace that? And then in the end, and this is what I think it's about, how can I respond to that in a way that actually makes a difference?
Right. So typically we would say the goal of Buddhism, the end game of Buddhism, is to help people to get rid of suffering. Would you agree with that?
No, I wouldn't agree with that. I think the end game of Buddhism is to accept suffering, is to understand suffering, to let go of the negative habits of mind, like doubt and attachment and anger and so forth and so on, to not let oneself be inflected or subsumed into or seduced by these emotional, instinctive reactions, these conditioned responses that pop up immediately in face of suffering, but to learn how to stabilize one's attention in such a way that you notice, as in mindfulness, there's anger. I don't need to go there. If I just watch the anger will eventually fizzle out if I don't fuel it. And then to learn to come to rest and dwell in a non-angry or a non-reactive space of mind. And that, I think, is at the heart of contemplative practice. But the purpose of this resting in this non-reactive space, which is essentially nirvana. Nirvana means the absence of anger, attachment, confusion. To dwell in depth in that stillness and that clarity then creates the adequate foundation for being able to respond to the suffering that you're experiencing in yourself or someone else's in a way that's not just a conditioned reaction, but is actually a heartfelt response to that suffering.
So you think that to do this kind of against the reactivity, the way to do that, the basis for getting to that level, what is that? It's just through practice, say, I'm not reacting. I'm telling myself not reacting. That's kind of how you're going to get there. Or actually, you really, truly think about who you are. Because even if you're not reacting, the I, me, is still there, right? Who is reacting? Who is not reacting? Who is this person reacting? What about this part? Are you addressing that part? Because, when you say not reacting to something is something external to you, right? Your environment. What about this reactor, the person who actually is making all those, emotional responses?
I think that's a second order question. I think it's an important question. And Buddhism has certainly got an awful lot to say about it. And in fact, much of my studies with my Tibetan teachers was all about figuring out what the self was. And that was helpful. that was valuable. But again, it doesn't actually address the core question of how to live in this moment. No matter how clear I have a good Buddhist understanding of the nature of the self, let's say in meditation, through my studies, how is that actually going to help me respond to someone who's maybe shouting at me or screaming at me, or if I see a person suffering in the street? The question of who is the person undergoing that is really not of any interest to me at that point. Instead, what I'm interested in to pursue this kind of path is to learn how to disentangle the habit patterns, the instincts, the conditionings, my own opinions and views, the opinions and views of others, so that I can actually find myself in my relationship with the world in a place that's not coming from that reactive past. It's actually opening me up to a space in which I can respond more appropriately. Doesn't mean I'll get it right. In fact, I might get it very badly wrong. But nonetheless, the teaching of the Buddha that I really seek to adhere to is to seek to embrace the suffering rather than wish it simply to be ended, and to respond to it without reactivity. But that has to operate within an ethical ecosystem. In other words, it's not just an instruction as simple as the one I've just said, but this ethical ecosystem, which includes values like love and compassion and kindness and equanimity and all of these things, these are structurally built in to all of these primary aspects of the practice, so that the responsiveness is not just happening in a vacuum, certainly not an ethical vacuum. It's cultivating, as it were, in the process of one's life and one's practice, those virtues that you feel, and the text will support, to be of greatest importance in being able to act responsibly, but not reactively. It's an ethical practice to engage with, in this case, to engage with you now. I mean, I don't think of what I'm doing when I'm having this conversation, but because my whole life is steeped in this attempt, maybe not a very good attempt, but an attempt nonetheless to live this way, in every situation in life, there's a part of me that seeks to honor and to adhere to that. I see my failings, I see my weaknesses, but I also occasionally surprise myself. And that's what matters. And ultimately, this might lead to the end of suffering. I don't know. But that's not my primary concern.
Okay, so like Mahayana Buddhism would consider like Buddha nature is in all of us, right? So, and it's just because we're ignorant, we don't see that, right? So, and then according to that point of view, even human beings, like, you know, the three-dimensional bodies, it's really just all the things we see around us, all the manifestations of a Buddha nature. Because early on you were talking about how are you going to reconcile this ultimate truth with the conventional truth.
Yeah.
It's isn't it, you know, sort of this kind of a Buddha nature, which is shapeless, colorless, and then, you know, something that you cannot describe. But that thing really can produce all the things that are around us. It's whatever we see, including ourselves, how we feel about ourselves, it's a manifestation of that Buddha nature. Would you agree with this kind of approach?
Well, I wouldn't. It's an approach. Again, I think there are a number of problems with it. The first of which is that it sounds an awful lot like God. I mean, everything you said about Buddha nature there, you could have said about God. There is some
it's true, except it's not personified, right? And it's not, because there's no such a concept of a figure over there, shapeless and formless, right?
You see, to me, that language that you just very eloquently spoke in, built into it is still this same division. You've got this ultimate truth, this Buddha nature that all beings have, and then you've got the forms and the difficulties and the elements of the world that are, you've got form and shape and smell and touch and so on. And yet all beings have the Buddha nature. If people do find that of help, and again, it's not a topic that I've ignored. I've studied this at some length with my Tibetan teachers, and my Zen teachers were exactly the same. The Buddha nature was absolutely central to all of this. But as with the notion of the two truths, you go back to the earliest sources, you go back to the Pali Canon, there's no mention of anything remotely like Buddha nature. So it looks to me very much like an idea that evolved in the course of Buddhism, and also was very much influenced by particularly the Hindu-Indian environment in which Buddhism emerged in the first centuries of its existence. So I think Buddha nature is a beautiful poetic language. They say the Buddha nature is like the honey inside the honeycomb, or it's like a golden Buddha statue wrapped in filthy cloth. I mean, these are all wonderful poetic images, and I have no problem with them at all. But as soon as you take them into, as it were, metaphysical theory, then you end up with problems, not just to get that to make sense, but also I think you step into a second order language, as I would call it. You step away from the immediacy of experience, and you're now speculating about the nature of some kind of divine or quasi-divine quality that all beings share. The Buddha, again, clearly recognized that all beings are able to become fully awake. He didn't call it Buddha nature. He simply recognized that that was the potential that human beings had. And what was, I think, remarkable about that was in the 5th century BC, he gives he makes no distinction between men and women. That was very unusual at that time. He acknowledged also that in the theory of reincarnation and so on, even animals and fleas and birds will also, if they are reborn as human, will likewise have this capacity to be fully enlightened. And so there is this very deep recognition in early Buddhism, although it may not be formally stated as such, that living beings are potentially Buddhas. Living beings have a capacity to be wise, to be kind, to be compassionate, to be tolerant, to care. And that's what to me matters. Again, it's an ethical sense I would have of Buddha nature. But it's not a term like ultimate truth that I ever use anymore.
Right. Okay. Anyway, switch gears.
Switch gears.
We've talked a lot about this ultimate truth versus convenient or conventional truth. So what about, there's one topic that scientists and then philosophers have been grappling with is consciousness.
Yes.
Right? So there's so much, so rich in Buddhist literature as well. What advice do you have to them, especially on the so-called the hard question of consciousness? What is this? How did they, come about? And then, how can we grapple with this concept of consciousness?
Well, I don't think we have probably enough time to get into the depths of this question. It is an important one. I agree with that. And obviously, as you point out in science today, the hard question of consciousness. I'll just make a few remarks on this from, again, the different studies and experiences I've had. When we go back to the early texts, we find it very clear that the Buddha understood consciousness to be an emergent property of an organism encountering an environment. In other words, consciousness is not, for the Buddha, some kind of pre-existent trait of a living organism. It only arises when that organism encounters through its senses, sees, hears, smells, tastes, or feels something, then the conditions for consciousness are present and consciousness arises. Consciousness, therefore, cannot be, if we put it into the language of the scientific studies of consciousness, consciousness cannot be reduced to a function of the brain, and also consciousness cannot exist without a functioning brain. But more importantly, consciousness cannot exist without an environment within which the organism is embedded. In other words, consciousness is an emergent property, and consciousness is also not something that is actually terribly important in terms of practicing ethics, for example. Some Buddhist traditions make a big deal out of consciousness, that insight into consciousness is a tantamount to knowing your true nature. My Zen teacher thought very much in these terms. But again, I think it's a second order question that misses the point.
So what about, because of Vedanta tradition, they talk about universal consciousness.
In the Vedanta tradition.
Yeah, Vedanta tradition, yeah. Talk about universal consciousness. And I think, there's also Tibetan word, right? What's it called?
Rigpa.
Yeah, Rigpa, all those things. Are those, do you think Rigpa and then universal consciousness, are they referring to the same thing?
Well, they might
that's
be.
That's the sort of the parent, or that's the sort of the mother of all consciousness. That's how I understand, okay? I understand the consciousness that you were just talking about. It's more of a conceptual construct. Or
no, it's
maybe
not
the feelings and perceptions of
consciousness. And again, I'm speaking in terms of what I can ascertain from what the Buddha himself said. Consciousness is one of the primary functions of the human being. There's the physical dimension, there's the affective or feeling dimension, there's the perceptual dimension, there's the active, responsive dimension, and there is an awareness, a consciousness of all of those things. All of these 5 aggregates, as they're sometimes called, are contingent, transitory phenomena that come and go. There is nothing within any of them, including consciousness, some kind of universal or transcendent or cosmic sense. And although, yes, in the Tibetan Dzogchen tradition, particularly, where they speak of Rigpa, Rigpa is something other than consciousness. It's a different term. Namse is consciousness. Rigpa is pristine awareness, is how it may be translated. And to me, this is a slippage away from what the Buddha was actually trying to communicate. It's a reverting to the Hindu or Vedantic tradition that the Buddha was seeking, not exactly to distance himself from, but to not really pursue that way of thinking. Vedanta came about quite a long time. I think Rigpa is very influenced by the notion of cosmic consciousness, universal consciousness, that you find in the Vedantic tradition that goes back to the Upanishads, the earliest Indian philosophical texts. But for me, that has really very little, if anything, to do with the Dharma as I understand it, that the Buddha taught.
Right. So you mentioned consciousness, but you only mentioned human beings. What about animals?
Oh no, all
creatures,
sentient beings have consciousness.
Plants? What about plants?
This is one of those big questions that Buddhists can't really seem to settle. Strictly speaking, in Buddhist doctrine, plants do not have consciousness. That's the view. But I think nowadays we need to look more closely at what natural sciences are telling us. And from my friends who are evolutionary biologists and so on, they're very, very reluctant to attribute consciousness to plant life and so on. And yet more and more we discover that plants are interacting with their organism.
Right.
They're responding in highly complex way. It's quite amazing. The question is, do we call that consciousness or not? I don't see why not, frankly. I don't feel that a problem. And I'm not going to take a dogmatic Buddhist position saying, no, plants don't have consciousness. Who knows? I think that's an open question, really.
Okay.
And I think the more we understand about consciousness as we experience it, the better we have an understanding of how it somehow works within a thing called the brain. We may then slowly be able to figure out that it might be something that's spread throughout the whole of life itself. I mean, you might go to a sort of panpsychism, if you wished, where everything has got a degree of consciousness within it. And I'm not entirely close to that view. I think that's quite a fascinating view.
I think, when I was reading some of your stuff, you seem to like Zen, right? More than other traditions. Why is that?
Because it emphasizes the questions rather than the answers. What drew me, I came to Zen after 7 or 8 years of full-time immersion in Buddhist scholarship, and for which I'm enormously grateful. I learned a great deal. It gave me the apparatus of thinking of concepts. But it also was very dogmatic. It had views and opinions and beliefs about most things. Plants are not conscious, for example, and it sought to somehow give you a series of arguments and reasons for believing certain things and not believing others. And there is some virtue to that, I agree. But it doesn't actually address the core question that is posed by every moment of your life. Mm-hmm. And I had an experience when I was probably 20 years old in India where I was suddenly overwhelmed by the fact that life was profoundly and utterly weird and mysterious and strange and incomprehensible in a way that really shook me to my core. And when I tried to communicate or speak to this to my Tibetan teachers, they didn't really know what I was talking about. And I then sought out in different Buddhist schools, are there any Buddhist schools that address this question of fundamental perplexity of life? Not as something to be overcome, but as something to be celebrated, something that is deeply core to our humanity. And the only school that really does focus in that way is Zen. And Zen, remember, is essentially a radical Chinese reform movement in Buddhism that occurred around the 5th, 6th centuries CE. And it broke with the intellectually top-heavy scholarship, the complicated rituals, the hierarchies of power, and said, no, this doesn't work. We're going to start again. We're going to go back to what the Buddha asked himself when he sat beneath that tree. In other words, it's to really recover the very questions without which the Buddha would have not had anything to answer to, as it were. In other words, I understand the Buddha's awakening, not just as some kind of mystical moment that suddenly occurred, but rather as a deeply authentic response to the questions that had led him as a human being to seek some kind of genuine resolution. The questions of birth, sickness, aging, and death. What in Chinese are called the great matter of birth and death. That's what set him on his quest. The same questions that may have propelled me as a young man in England to go to India or whoever it might be in any country today. And yet when you get someone who does get that kind of insight, very quickly after that person's death, it gets codified into a kind of dogmatic system. It gets established into an institution of hierarchy and power. It gets allied with different political forces. And if you look at the history of Buddhism, it's usually with very conservative, reactionary forces. And when Buddhism came to China, for the first time, it encountered a highly literate philosophical culture. It wasn't like Sri Lanka or Thailand or something, but here was a very sophisticated society. And yet it too was in crisis. End of the Han dynasty, breakdown of central authority, and Chinese people were looking for another way of considering their lives in this world. And Zen, or Chan, really in Chinese, is what responded to that need. But initially, Buddhism failed in a way to engage the Chinese. They needed their own particular way that would make those teachings relevant to their situation then. And inevitably, they drew upon indigenous Taoist ideas primarily, and they rejected Orthodox Buddhism, and they just went back and sat and asked themselves, what is this? What is going on? Who am I? What is this life about? Mm-hmm. And that question is not just where you begin and then you can forget about it. That question, if anything, for me, has become more puzzling, intriguing, compelling now than it was when I started. When you engage with the question of life, when you look deeply into it, when you keep inquiring, the world does not thereby become somehow more clear and self-evident. If anything, it becomes more mysterious, more strange. So what, to me, is fantastic about the Chan, Zen, or Son traditions is that it keeps this quality of fundamental questioning alive. It doesn't just accept a bunch of religious doctrines or beliefs.
Okay, so why do you think Zen has those kind of ask the big questions, the fundamental questions, but without answers, and use all the koans and whatnot, right? Mm-hmm. Why do you think it's without answers? If it's just about this life, it's just about social issues, they should be able to have answers. Why don't they have answers?
I think they're not. Well, if you actually look at Zen in history, then of course they have answers. I mean, Zen said, this is a teaching without words and letters. And yet they've produced probably more literature than any other Buddhist school. They've got plenty of answers. In fact, my own Zen teachers had very, firm convictions about this, that, and the other. The point is not that you don't have answers. The point is that you take answers a little bit less seriously, that you treat the answers that you come up with more like hypotheses, tentative solutions, ways that might be fruitful to pursue. But you don't crystallize them into dogmas, final answers, ultimate truths. You treat them more lightly. You treat them more provisionally. And in a deeper sense still, I think the point of Zen is not actually to come up with answers in that kind of conceptual sense, but it's about more how to respond appropriately to situations. What I'm interested in is an appropriate response to a situation. There's a famous koan with the Chinese master Yunmen, who was asked, what is the highest teaching of the Buddha? And he answered, an appropriate statement. In other words, there is no right answer in the sense that it would fit every single situation. It'll be true for all time. There are only responses that are more or less appropriate to the situation at hand. And that, I feel, is very much at the heart of Zen.
That's very confusion as well, by the way.
Well, it could,
it's a context appropriateness.
Yeah, that would make total sense because he's Chinese.
Right.
That's where he's coming from.
My read of the fact that koans have no answers is really they all point to the ultimate truth, which cannot be reduced to words and analysis. That's my read of it. Okay,
well, fair enough.
So they really sort of by asking those big questions, they really try to or challenge you with your conventional understanding about who you are, what the rules are around you, and then essentially knock off your the conventional sense perceptions, and then perhaps at that certain split second you'll get something, right? So that's kind of the sudden enlightenment, right? That's kind of what the sudden enlightenment is about. That's how I see it. So in a way, the fact that they don't have answers precisely because that's point to some sort of ultimate truth. Just like
but you see, that is an answer. The answer is that they point to ultimate truth.
They point to something, but then that's because that something cannot be reduced to words. That's why you don't have answers.
That's again.
So you're not going to have answers.
That's a theory one could hold. I don't disagree with that. It's just not a way I find very helpful to think or speak anymore.
So actually, my next set of questions will be relating to key features of secular Buddhism.
Oh, secular Buddhism, yes.
Yeah, that's what you're known for. That's what you've been preaching for. Yeah. Again, actually, maybe before you answer that question, I want a bit of a personal angle, in the sense that, like, when when did you start questioning some of the teachings, and what are which part of the teaching or practices that you have gone through, kind of quote unquote turn you off a little bit against this metaphysical pursuit of a Buddhism? Can you explain a little bit your personal journey on that?
It's a bit difficult because when I arrived in India, 19-year-old young guy from London trying to figure out what Buddhism was about with my Tibetan teachers, I was an innocent. I didn't know anything, and I was extraordinarily impressed by the Tibetan lamas I knew, and I more or less had complete faith in them. But one of the things that, in a way, gave me that faith was that a statement they repeated again and again and again was, you should examine the Dharma in the same way as a goldsmith analyzes a piece of gold. You should cut it and rub it and burn it, and only when you're certain that it's gold should you accept it as being really gold. And this is this is a quote from the Buddha. And in the same way, the Buddha says, you do not accept what I say just because you have faith in me. Okay, so I was encouraged from a very young age not to take these teachings simply for granted, to analyze them, to critique them. And that is why after 3 or 4 years of my basic studies, I then went and specialized in Buddhist philosophy with one of my teachers, who was the philosophical advisor to the Dalai Lama, where he was going to teach me the logic, epistemology, and so on, to actually get to prove that, for example, reincarnation is a fact. They claim in Tibetan Indian Buddhism to be able to demonstrate these things through reason and logic. And I was very, very interested in that. But when I actually got to see the arguments, the syllogisms for reincarnation, they didn't even meet the standards of logic required by Tibetan logic. Mm-hmm. In other words, they were basically beliefs that were propped up as well as you could prop them up with some kind of rational argument. That was a moment at which I began to doubt. I already had my doubts about doctrines like reincarnation, as I think many Westerners would, but I was also, very, disappointed in a way that the arguments from the tradition were not at all compelling. And I'd also been encouraged to question. And so what I feel I'm doing in my work is not to go against my Buddhist training and background and tradition. I personally feel that I'm carrying forward the very instructions I was given by especially my Tibetan teachers, to never stop questioning and analyzing texts, of my Zen teacher to always keep the mind in a state of questioning, from my Theravada mindfulness practice to always be truthful and honest with what exactly is going on. So I feel that if we are to take the Dharma into our world today, we need to come from that place of honesty. We need to have the ability to at least have a certain openness to suspicion and doubt. And I think Buddhism has evolved over the centuries because there have been generation after generation of practitioners like the Zen monks we spoke of, who have criticized the tradition, have come up with something reconfigured, something reformed. Buddhism, I feel, is like a living organism. It's not like a sort of eternal set of truths. And that organism is adapting environmentally to the different cultures that it meets. As the Dharma enters into modernity, post-modernity, in this kind of global or planetary situation we're in now, it needs to adapt itself to the questions of this time and this age. And particularly with the understanding we now have, not only of the human being, but of the natural world through the sciences, I don't think many traditional religious practices are any longer, strictly fit for purpose in this day and age. Buddhism, as it has done in the past, will try to figure out ways to adapt itself to the situation we're in now. And that's basically what led me in the end to name this thing called secular Buddhism. Mm-hmm. A Buddhism that is of this seculum, of this age, of this time, and one that speaks to the conditions and the suffering of this age and this time.
Mm-hmm. So what are the key features if you were to summarize?
Secular Buddhism?
Secular Buddhism, yeah.
Well, I think the first thing really is that it's a practice of the Dharma that is entirely concerned with the well-being of life on this earth. That it has an agnostic view regarding what happens after death to the individual, to the existence or non-existence of other realms of existence, but focuses its concern on how can we live authentically, wisely, compassionately on this earth now for the benefit of the living beings who flourish on this planet and who, as far as we know, are the only such forms of life that have ever occurred anywhere. We have no evidence that such lives exist anywhere else in the universe. They probably do, statistically, but we don't know that. So I think a secular Buddhism is one that is entirely concerned with this life, but that does not mean, and I'm often criticized for this, that I don't have any interest in what happens after my death.
Mm-hmm.
That is entirely wrong. A secular Buddhism is one that recognizes that the acts what we do now will have consequences, not so much for me in some hypothetical future life, which is the traditional view, but our actions will have consequences after our deaths.
Mm-hmm.
You and I, let's say I might die tomorrow, but this conversation will continue to go out. My books will continue to be published. My life, my work will continue to reverberate into maybe for a few years after my death, maybe for longer, who knows? But I think we bear an enormous responsibility for the continuation of life on this earth. And that is what is now widely understood to be a threat. And again, I'm not just thinking of human beings. Buddhism has always been very clear that its purview is not the human, but the sentient. It's all sentient beings that are our concern.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And the extent to which we now understand how sentient life permeates absolutely
everywhere.
Yeah. In our microbiome, in our gut and so on. So I think what a secular Buddhism would consider is that rather than future lives, the future of life on earth would be its concern. So that would be one primary feature of a secular Buddhism. Mm-hmm. It would also, I think, be an approach to the Dharma that would question the fact as to whether it needs to be embodied in a religious structure. Is Buddhism a religion? This is a question that's been asked ever since the West became aware of Buddhism. Is it a religion like Christianity or Islam? And clearly we think it is. Buddhism is acknowledged as one of the three world religions. And if you go to a Buddhist temple anywhere in Asia, you would be very hard pressed to say that's not a religion. It's got all the trappings, priests, incense, prayers, the lot. Mm-hmm. So is that really the form that is most suited to the Dharma in our times? Are we not moving, or are many people not moving into a post-religious or post-creedal world? Religious practice in the country where I live, in France, for example, has more or less fizzled out. And yet people are still asking the sorts of questions that traditionally religions have provided answers to. But religion has become toxic for many contemporary people. The Dharma, I feel, could likewise be liberated from the constraints of being a religion if it could begin to see itself as a secular rather than a religious movement. If it could divest itself of the need for priests and temples. I feel that some kind of organizational structure would, of course, still be necessary. Some kind of art, particularly, would hopefully express also where we might move on in our imagination. But I do feel that particularly if we go back to the early Pali texts, which don't require us to talk of ultimate relative truth or Buddha nature or any of these things, we can start again. Like the Chan Zen monks did in 6th century China, we can go back to the beginnings and we can start all over again and try to find a language, a form, structures, communities, forms of art, literature, writing that will speak to our condition in the world we live in now. So that too would be a very important element of secular Buddhism.
On this, actually, I just want to, in fact, I actually agree with you. I echo your point of view about whether or not we should treat Buddhism as a form of a religion. And I do think the Buddhism initially, I mean, it's really against this idol worshipping, right? And then against this institutionalization of this, the whole practice. But of course, subsequently, it became a huge institution, as we know. So in a way, I like to, because I'm very much into it. I call myself a great wisdom learner or wisdom practitioners. I would not say I'm a Buddhist per se. I would say it's a wisdom practitioner. But then, of course, my teacher would draw on a lot of the Buddhist intellectual resources to help address some of the questions, but none of that formalities. Okay, like in terms of the idol worshipping, in terms of daily or whatever, every 2 weeks, and you have to burn incense and this and that. But of course, if we go to temples, we're going to show proper respect, right? But then that's not at all required. And so I on that point, I'm completely in agreement with you. Although I still think there is ultimate truth, and then versus conventional truth thing. So, but on the sort of the institutionalization and idolization of Buddhism, I'm very much with you.
But you don't think these two things might go together? The ultimate truth, God, and these things all tend to generate these kinds of structures.
That's where the so-called wonder. I know you use wonder and mystery. I don't know what exactly you're referring to. Maybe you can explain that. But I think, when you think about there's something that's shapeless and formless, but then can give rise to all those things, that in itself is a miracle in a sense, from human perception point of view. That's another thing that do you always consider yourself as humans, the embodied humans? Obviously, you prefer to think in those terms. But then if we use this kind of theory of a Buddha nature, and then I do think, I agree there's a phenomenon of reincarnation and this and that, but I think that's illusory. So in a way, if you believe that's true, and then you actually, it's just means that you're confused. Okay, so in a way, but that so-called the ultimate Buddha nature, shapeless and formless. In fact, I think we are truly that thing. So in a way, I don't think it's this is a superstition. I know you are able to analyze and reason and have that kind of insights. Let's put it that way, and then without idolization or institutionalization of the wisdom practice. Mm-hmm. So anyway, so we agree with the conclusion, but then still the metaphysical part,
I think we still hold on to the metaphysical part. No, I can understand that.
Yeah.
And
because I do think that's actually, it has a great explanatory power, I think. But anyway, that could be a topic of another, discussion. Okay, so any other features? Because obviously meditation, right? So you talked about. Is that yeah?
Let's look at another feature. Really, I think of a secular Buddhism is that it would really try to reconfigure what we mean by this much used word practice. If you find yourself amongst a bunch of Buddhists, mm-hmm. the first thing that they'll probably tell you is what kind of practice they do. And that practice is usually then a certain form of spiritual exercise, meditation. If I ask my Buddhist friends, what's your practice? They'll say, I do Vipassana, or I do Dzogchen, or whatever it might be. And I think that's a very reductive and narrow use of the word practice. Meditation is certainly one of the practices that Buddhism holds in high esteem, but there are at least 7 others. And when the Buddha uses the word practice, he doesn't equate it with meditation. He equates it with the cultivation of the Eightfold Path. And the Eightfold Path is the very first thing the Buddha supposedly announced after his enlightenment. Mm-hmm. And that is not reducible to just spiritual exercises. It has to do with the way we see the world. It has to do with the way we think, the way we imagine, the way we speak, the way we work, the way we survive, the way we energize ourselves. And it has to do with how we cultivate ourselves inside our minds, with mindfulness and samadhi and concentration and so on. What has happened over the centuries and I think a lot of this has to do with the monastic institutional structure of Buddhism, is that Buddhism has become to be seen really as what monks do. And the people who do Buddhism best are therefore, professional clerics and priests. Mm. And the result of that is that it's tended to marginalize those aspects of the Eightfold Path which are to be cultivated and developed, that have to do with non-monastic life. So there's very little in the texts about, for example, livelihood and work. It's mentioned, but there's not as much attention given to that as, say, meditation. Buddhist texts are very good on meditation. They're not very good in terms of, imagination, for example, would be another one. So a secular approach would be one that would try to see the core ways in which we lead our lives, whether it's through the imagination, whether it's through our work, whether it's through our inner contemplation, that all of the aspects of one's life as practice have equal value. As a writer, I see my practice as a communicator just as important as my practice as a meditator. I think the reason meditation has become so central to the way Buddhism is presented in the West is because that's a tradition we've lost if we ever had it. And I think it does provide us with something that our own traditions have failed to provide. I think the popularity and success of mindfulness, which is in a sense the foremost example of the secularization of Buddhism. I mean, secular Buddhism comes at the same time as the secularization of Buddhism in mindfulness. But the danger there is we still think, well, mindfulness is what Buddhism is all about. It's not. Mindfulness is only one of many factors that need to be cultivated in harmony and in tandem in such a way that one learns to flourish more fully as a human being. I think Buddhist practice is not about enlightenment in some mystical sense. It's about human flourishing, eudaimonia, as the Greeks would have called it. And that is a secular Buddhist practice, one that's not just about being good at the things that monks are otherwise good at doing. It's about living one's life in a conscious and in a focused way in which every aspect of your humanity is given equal significance.
Right. So under secular Buddhism, you would actually treat Buddhist teaching mostly as a ethical teaching. I mean, essentially, they are the ethical teaching, right? For secular Buddhism. Are there differences between secular Buddhism and then the ethical teaching of secular Christianity, let's say? What are the key differences?
I think secular Christianity could just as well be called humanism, really. I was brought up as a humanist. And humanism is really Christian ethics without Christianity. I think secular Buddhism is very close to humanism. I think it's also very close to something like Epicureanism or Stoicism. I think the Hellenistic philosophies are very, very similar in many regards to what I consider to be a secular dharma. They're not religious overtly, and yet they do address and they give one methodologies as how to cultivate, a spiritual life, if you wish, a meaningful life, an engaged life. So yes, that is. I think it's I'm not so much interested in the dialogue between Buddhism and Christianity or other religions. I'm far more interested in what Buddhism has to say humanists and what humanists might have to say to Buddhists or philosophers or psychologists. Buddhism's attracted an enormous range of secular people who are not interested in finding another religion, but they find that Buddhism has methods, skills, philosophical ideas, ethical concepts that are very, very helpful in helping them, further develop their own traditions. So in that sense, I think there is a place for Buddhism to inhabit the secular world in a meaningful way as another secular tradition.
That's been actually ongoing for a while, right? In the sense that You named Soka Gakkai, and then it's also in Taiwan. There's
Foguangshan people.
Foguangshan people, and then so
they call it humanistic Buddhism in Taiwan.
Yes, they call it humanistic
Buddhism.
But again, my interpretation of that is that's the expedient means.
Yeah, okay.
So in a way, once they bringing into the door of Buddhism, and then if it's the right teaching, they better teach them about the ultimate truth.
Well, fair enough. Mm-hmm.
So anyway, in a way, I haven't come to this paradigm shift notion that you proposed. Is the Dharma-centered city or awakening culture?
The culture of awakening.
Yeah, culture of awakening. Yes, the culture of awakening. Can you explain what that is and what that entails?
I wrote a book back in 1997 that was called Buddhism Without Beliefs. And this is what nowadays would be called my breakout or breakthrough work. That's the book that somehow gained me a degree of attention I hadn't previously had, and has enabled me to then basically develop my vocation as a Buddhist writer. Mm-hmm. And one of the key terms in that book is the idea of a culture of awakening. And it goes back, in fact, to the question we spoke of earlier, the question of, is Buddhism a religion or not? Mm-hmm. And the answer I gave then was, no, Buddhism is more like a culture than a religion. To think of Buddhism as a culture being, an organized collection of capacities that human beings have that are consistent over time and that enable people to live both individually and in society together. A culture, well, we all know what a culture is. And I think Buddhism, to me, has always impressed me more as a culture than as a religion. I have a friend in Japan, a Jodo Shinshu priest, who talks about ambient Buddhism. Ambient Buddhism. And when you go to Japan, or when I go on pilgrimage to places in India and other Asian countries, you feel that Buddhism is somehow in the atmosphere, that there's something Buddhistic, if not overtly Buddhist, about the architecture, the way people organize their gardens, the way I've noticed in Asia, the gentleness with which things are held around the house. There are Buddhistic qualities that may not come exclusively from Buddhism. They may also come from indigenous traditions, Confucianism, and elsewhere. But nonetheless, there's a quality of Buddhism that filters through in forms that are not explicitly or outwardly Buddhist. And, it's very difficult to put one's finger on that. But I feel that we can understand Buddhism, and I think there's a long history of Buddhist cultures that have lived, that a part of those cultures are religious institutions. You could also think of it that way as well. But I'd put the emphasis not on the religion, but on the culture in which such religions are able to thrive. So a culture of awakening would be an admittedly very ideal projection of how I would like to see the Dharma taking form in the future, or maybe even in our times, more as a cultural force than as a religious force, a force that perhaps come to us through literature and through books and through movies and through films and through theatre, which slowly begin to assume or take on board certain Buddhist values and ideas. And you can see this happening now already. I spot, when I watch a TV series or whatever it might be, the little Buddhist bits and pieces that are flagged here and there, quite unintentionally probably. But they're indicators of how, since I first got involved in Buddhism in the 1970s, you wouldn't have found that sensibility then. Whereas today, Buddhism has kind of inveigled its way into the fabric, not just of Western culture, but I think of a kind of emerging global, or as you might say here, a planetary culture. And it's in that regard that I feel that the Dharma Buddhism can benefit not just Buddhists, but people who are drawn to some of these similar values. So culture of awakening, it wouldn't be exclusively Buddhist. I don't think of it as that at all, but I see it as something that could integrate and assume a certain kind of Buddhist sensibility that at present we don't have.
So is it fair to say you are actually cultivating and promoting that culture of awakening through your speeches and talks and books? That's
exactly.
kind of what you're
That's
trying to do,
essentially
right?
what is going on.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm not doing it as a sort of a campaign.
Right.
But yes, I feel that is exactly what's going on. And I see it not only obviously in my own work, but in the work of my colleagues and friends and Buddhist communities around the world, in the work of people like John Kabat-Zinn, the man who founded the whole mindfulness movement. Mm-hmm. He's told me in private that he sees mindfulness as basically Buddhism, Buddhist values and ideas filtering into. It's a means whereby
he's using as an expedient.
It's an expedient means.
Yes.
No, it's a skillful means. No, very, very much so.
Yeah.
I have no problem with that.
Yeah.
And I think we can spot that all over the place.
Thank you so much, Stephen, for joining the conversation. And I really appreciate your patience in answering so many questions. And then I've been drilling you on some of the, core issues to me anyway. So thank you so much for spending time with us.
Well, thank you, Bing. I've greatly enjoyed talking with you. It's been wonderful to interact in this way. And I've really enjoyed the fact that we don't agree with each other. I think that is the necessary ingredient for any healthy conversation. So thank you.
Completely agree. Thank you.
Good.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Futurology is a Studio B and Waveland production with distribution from Realm. Our executive producers are Nicholas Berggruen, Nathan Gardells, Dawn Nakagawa, Nils Gilman, and Jason Hoke. Futurology is produced by Grant Slater, Alex Gardells, and Natalia Ramos. Our associate producer is Alyssa Mardini. Futurology's theme music was composed by Marcus Bagala. The show is mixed and mastered by Aaron Bastinelli. Special thanks to Heather Mason, Olivia De Rienzo, Carly Migliori, and Nick Goddard.